coming tonight to learn more about the history of our area. We thank you for those who are willing to research and present and let us know so that we can remember the good and the interesting things that happen in our area. We thank thee for being able to live here and being able to enjoy the freedoms that we have. We pray tonight that thou might bless those who are participating, that they might have thy spirit, and bless each of us that we might be able to learn something from this presentation. And we say this in the name of thy Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Francis and Sandy, for leading us in the pledge and the prayer. We have a couple of announcements here to begin tonight. Since this is the beginning of the new year, we need to talk a little bit about dues. Now, Suzanne, Francis, Cynthia, and others on the committee asked me to get up here and give a 15-minute monologue, PBS monologue, on joining, paying your dues, and supporting it. I'm not going to do that tonight. But just to remind you that if you're not paid up, please do so, because we have some excellent presenters coming in, giving us information about our history and the background of our area here. Some of the upcoming presentations here, next month in February, we'll have a history on the Hiawatha, the settlement and the development of Hiawatha. In March, we'll have a presentation on the Spirit Railroad. In April, the history of the Cleveland Lloyd Dinosaur Quarry. And then for our trek in June, hopefully we'll be able to go out and visit the new Jurassic Park National Monument out there. So we've got some exciting upcoming events here in our society. Tonight, we're very privileged to have Wade Allinson as our presenter. Wade is a resident of Farron. He's married to Jenny Lynn Jeffs, daughter of Lee and Ray Jeffs here in Castledale. Wade has been involved in the law enforcement for over 35 years. He's been an officer and active involved in that. He's also been involved in our history and community affairs in the county. He's given numerous presentations on history events and activities in many of the organizations such as the Spanish Trail Association, the Oregon-California Trail, Utah Sheriff's Association, and here in our History Society. He's created a new podcast called Wading Through History. And we might ask him to explain it. I took the opportunity to look at that, and that's a fascinating report. Apparently he's going to be continuing to do that. I've got one last personal thing I'd like to say about Wade. When I first moved back to the county, I was running cattle on the south side of the Farron allotment. And one fall I was driving cattle down the lower trail. This is the trail down on the rim of the Muddy that winds around forever before you get out there. And I came upon a section of trail there that had been cleared of brush, and all of the overhanging branches of the juniper and pinyon trees had been cut off. And on the base of those branches, there was a brand, and initials cut in the stumps there, W.A. When I got back with the rest of the cowboys there, I asked them, what's this W.A. that's all along the trail down here? They said, well, that's Wade Allinson. I said, who's Wade Allinson? They said, well, he's a local volunteer that's come along here, spending his time clearing these trails for the cattlemen, the trail riders, and other associations. And that day, I tipped my hat to Wade for saving me a lot of aggravation going in and out of that brush and under those tree limbs. And so we appreciate that service that you've contributed there, Wade. Today, he's going to be giving a presentation on Alfred Packer, the Man-Eater. This is an interesting and fascinating title here about a man in the early history here. Note that this is 1874. That's before any settlement of the area here. Castle Valley was settled in 1877. So he came through with some prospectors years before that in a trek through Colorado and Utah. And this would be the story of the heroin experience that he had. So Wade, we appreciate you coming tonight and look forward to this presentation.
I'm going to turn off these lights in the front here. Well, the hardest part of the presentation is now over. Oops. Jenny Lynn's telling me I need to stand here, so I do what I'm told. No, seriously, having somebody talk about you is the worst part of it, but thank you. So I was originally going to speak on Cottonwood Canyon, and hopefully maybe the Historical Society will have me back in the fall, and maybe we can talk about Cottonwood Canyon. I kind of switched gears on them because I've been reading a few books about Alfred Packer, and I got to throw out as we start this presentation, I'm going to go back and forth between Alfred and Alferd, and I'll explain it to you why there's a couple different names for him, and but I got to throw that out. I can't keep it straight either, and neither could he, and we'll explain that why here in just a minute. So if I say Alfred or Alferd, just know we're just talking about the same guy here. And when I was reading about him, I thought, you know, this would be a really fun topic to study and to go through and to learn a little bit about this guy, because he has some interesting ties to our area. And these are some of the reasons why. He came through Emery County in 1873, the winter of 1873, so it's December. Most of what we're going to talk about occurs in 1874, but nonetheless, he was here in 1873, and that's for Emery County really early history, because there really wasn't much here in 1873. You probably had Sam Gilson running around a little bit. You had the Chipman brothers, and the Benyons running around here a little. And then, of course, 74, the Swayze started rattling in here. So not a lot going on in 1873. And then the other part of it I found interesting, we'll get into this, is he had a traveling companion that most of us will recognize, and we're going to talk a little bit about him. And yeah, it's an interesting story, and it also ties in a little bit with Fremont and his fourth expedition when he went through the San Juan Mountains, and there was some most likely some cannibalism going on there too. So that's what kind of caught my interest. So this is the reason why we get mixed up with Alfred and Alferd. He was actually born Alfred. That's probably the correct pronunciation of that. But poor old Alfred wasn't very literate, and he got a tattoo on his arm, and he spelled his name wrong. And so he had the wrong name on his arm. So that's why when you look him up, his given name is Alfred, but you'll find the literature and stuff on him is Alferd, and that's what was tattooed on his arm. Okay, I want to pull up this song real quick. Just bear with me 1 second here. So the Historical Society usually has a song. I told them I'd take care of the song on this one.
An infamous guy in the Old West. In the state of Colorado in the year of 74, they crossed the San Juan Mountains, gold hungry to the core. Their guide was Alfred Packer, they trusted him too long, for his character was weak and his appetite was strong. They called him a murderer, a cannibal, a thief, It just doesn't pay to eat anything but government-inspected beef. Along the Gunnison River, an Indian camp they spy. An Indian chief approached them, to stop them he'd try. He warned them of the danger in the snow that lay around. But the danger was in Packer, for his hunger knew no bound. Yes, they called him a murderer, a cannibal, a thief. It just doesn't pay to eat anything but government-inspected beef. 2 cold months went slowly by, Packer came back alone. My comrades, they all froze to death, I'm starving, he did moan. The Indian chief knew how he lied, he spat upon the ground. For his belly hung out all over his belt, he gained some 30 pounds. They called him a murderer, a cannibal, a thief. It just doesn't pay to eat anything but government-inspected beef. Well, for 9 long years he ran away, but finally he was tried. He claimed he didn't kill them, he only ate their hide. That county had 6 Democrats until he did a ride. Well, only one lives on today, he ate the other 5. Yes. 18 years he stayed in jail, it was a dreadful fate. For he suffered indigestion every time he ate. Still, it's hard to blame this hungry guy that went searching for the mines. For when he ate his friends, he'd never heard of Duncan Hines. For when he ate his friends, he'd never heard of Duncan Hines.
That's kind of a fun little song. So anyway, there's actually several songs if you want to search them, and as you can imagine, there's quite a heyday with the media and songs and papers and books, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. So this is always pretty interesting. In fact, Ed Gary reminds me, it's too bad he can't be here. So at the University of Colorado, at the Boulder campus, there's actually an Alfred Packer grill and restaurant there. And Ed Gary reminds me that he's actually ate at that grill and restaurant. So I thought that was kind of fun. And the motto there is the motto is to have a friend for lunch. So, you know, this is just fun. And yeah, well, it might get serious here, but still, it's pretty fun. So a little background on Alfred. He was born in 1842, maybe 1843. There's a little conflicting information on there. He was one of 8 children. Father was a carpenter. He joined the Union Army in the infantry, and he was discharged because he was incapable of performing his duties because he had epilepsy, which is basically seizures. He went in and went to a different state a few months later and enlisted in another volunteer regiment, and lasted a little bit longer there, but he was eventually discharged there again. But in Tennessee, it's kind of where he starts off a little bit. He was plundering citizens there while he was there in the war. We'll talk a little bit more about that. A lot of false information about him out there. And Packer was probably responsible for a lot of that. He claimed he was a scout for General Armstrong Custer, but that's completely false. And as we'll learn here, that he claimed he knew his way around the San Juan Mountains, which became very evident. Once he couldn't follow tracks, he had no idea where he was going. Timeline on him: born in 1843, 1862, was in the Army. 1860s, I don't know the exact date, but somewhere in the 1860s he was in Colorado. 1871 he gets into Utah. And I find that kind of interesting that he's here in 1871, especially not being a Mormon. 1874 is the cannibalism. He's convicted in 1881, and then imprisoned. And then he gets a parole in 1901, and 1907 he died. So he kind of followed into Colorado. When in some of my studies, a lot of the Civil War soldiers, they were looking to get their fortune, and they headed off into Colorado to participate in some of the gold and silver rushes there. And it was both gold and silver. An interesting identifier is he lost 2 of his fingers while in Colorado in a mining accident. And he was a jackwhacker. And that's a person who would lead a bunch of mules in a string that would take supplies up to the miners. And oftentimes these jackwaggers, they would take supplies up in the morning, and then they would come back down with ore in the sides of the panniers and the pack mules. And as I mentioned, he had lots of seizures, and they left him incapacitated, often for several days. So I find this really interesting. In 1871, he's in Utah, and I find him in both Sandy and Bingham. And I'll talk a little bit more why Sandy. He spent 90 days in jail in Salt Lake, and he just basically drifted around the different mining camps. And Sandy would have worked at the big smelters there. I don't know if any of you remember, but there was always those big stacks there in Sandy, but he worked there for a bit. And I really like his story about being in Bingham Canyon. I know this isn't a great photo, but it's one of the oldest ones I could find. Many of you may know where Bingham Canyon is. That hits close to me because my dad was actually born in Bingham Canyon. And if you go into Salt Lake and look up to the mine dumps, and it basically, the mine dumps up there from Kennecott has completely covered up Bingham Canyon. So it no longer exists, but it's got a great story, especially for me. This is kind of what it looked like going through the canyon there. So the newspapers were reporting a silver strike, and I'm sure it's gold. It's pretty hard to separate both of them, but so a lot of the miners were leaving Bingham Canyon and headed to the San Juan Mountains, and this apparently caught Alfred's attention. So he heads south. So he leaves Salt Lake Valley and he heads south, and he stops off in Provo. And what's interesting is what I can find about him is when he heads south, he's all by himself. He's on foot, and he arrives in Provo. Provo is kind of basically a stopping point because that's about a day's travel on foot or horse to get down there. So he gets there, and he starts finding others that are kind of getting ready to gear up that have the same idea that he did. This guy here plays an interesting story. Bob here, McGrew, he also worked at Bingham Canyon. And he was a freight hauler, and he actually had at least 2 wagons, and I think he took both of them with him to the San Juans. And then he had a partner named George Tracy, and both of them together decided to go to the San Juans, and they're getting ready to kit up there in Provo, and Alfred Packer walks in. So Packer presented himself to Bob and to Tracy that he knew the way to the San Juans. However, he was broke, had no money, and these guys had more than one person going with them. They had about 20 others that were going with them, well, probably more like 18 or 19. And they all would chip in and pay, and they would pay for, it was called a grub stake, and they would pay to be part of his wagons to go to the San Juans. But Alfred had no money. He said he could work with the horses. He knew his way there. And McGrew actually chipped in the money for his grub stake in the partnership. So this is interesting. And this is really what catch my attention with one of the key aspects. Is in Provo, he picks up our Preston Nutter. And for most of you, that's probably a familiar name with us here in Emery County with the Nutter Ranch up in the 9 Mile area. He had also been working in the mines in Salt Lake and Bingham area. And I just find it interesting that Preston joins the group in Provo. It kind of tells me that maybe Preston was one of those that was headed to the San Juans already too, because I really can't imagine why else Preston would, of all places, in 1873 be in Provo, but nonetheless he was there, and he paid his grub stake. And a lot of what we know about Alfred and what happened and the court, are all statements from Preston. I just kind of wanted to point out here, from the start, Preston noticed that the group was poorly provisioned. So the other part that I really like about this, and it took a little bit of digging in a couple different books, but the group heads south and they go to Salina. They would not have gone up Spanish Fork Canyon for a bunch of reasons. Spanish Fork would not have been the choice place to go, especially late in November. If you ever notice, when you come over Salina Canyon, it tends to have a lot less snow during that time of year than the top of Soldier Summit. And that would have been the more established route. There really was not much of a route going up Spanish Fork. There was one, but this would have been the better way to go. And in Salina, they pick up this guy named Alferd, and I really can't pronounce his last name, so I won't, but everybody called him Lot. And it's interesting that this guy is in Salina, and I tried to figure that out too. And I've actually tried to reach out to some of his descendants, they're still around in Colorado, to find out what he was doing in Salina, because he was not a Mormon, and he was just kind of hanging in there. I don't know if he was just getting ready to head to the San Juans, but nonetheless, he was in Salina. And I find it interesting that he was a sheriff in Bozeman, Montana, and he has family buried in Montana as well. So we're up to 21 guys, including Alfred. They had 2 weeks of supplies to get to their destination on the San Juans. We already talked that they were poorly outfitted. Everybody paid their way, and immediately Preston Nutter did not like Alfred. He just kind of wore him thin. These are some of the things that I read about what Nutter said about him. He said he was a man without character. He was willing to take things that did not belong to him, whether of any value or not. He would take more than his share of food. They found him in a lot of lies. When he'd take the food, he would go and hide and eat it. In fact, they asked the group leader, Bob McGrew, if he would kick him out, and Bob wouldn't. So in 1874, they're on the banks of the Green River, and this is really where things start to go south. Because up to this point, the trail would have been very easy to follow for a couple of reasons. One is it's a common trail to the banks of the Green River, and then after the Green River, that's where the trail from California to Santa Fe to California, Josh, that's where the trail would have split right after the Green River, and you would have the southern branch that some will call the Old Spanish Trail, and the northern branch. So right there, your traffic would have been divided. But at this point, there was actually snow on the ground, and Alfred had no other tracks to follow. So this is where the party starts to notice that Alfred does not know where he's going. Prior to that point, it was not very hard to follow him with all the traffic that came up Salina Canyon, with the various military expeditions and things. That there was a pretty good trail over at least to Green River. The river was high enough that they had to take the wagons apart, and they would have floated them over there. So anyway, this is where it goes south. It's right here in our own Green River. Food's running low, and it fell on Preston and this Lot guy to go out and to scout the path. I'm sure they were trying to look for any signs of where the trail had gone. The game was scarce. It talks about that they would occasionally find a rabbit. But they were able to get a few Indian guides along the way, and they ended up having to resort to eating a horse. So you get to Montrose, Colorado, in that area, and Chief O'Ray runs into him, and he surrounds them all because they were actually trespassing on Indian lands, and he was suspicious of what their motives were. And fortunately, Chief O'Ray, with his association with that area of the state, he could speak Spanish, and there was a member of their group that could also speak Spanish, so they were able to have a conversation, and they were able to convince the good chief here that they were just passing through and that they intended not to stick around in the area. And this guy, Chief O'Ray, was really a very good guy to him. He's just one of those good individuals that took that group under their wing and said, yeah, you can stay here. They actually camped a little bit away from their camp, but in very close proximity to him. So the winter of 1874 in my studies was probably one of the worst ones they had on record up to that point. And it was just bad timing. They left very late. If they would have left a couple months earlier, they would have been a lot better. And to add to their misery, I'm sure it took more and more time to find the trail and the different points that they needed to hit, and they just couldn't get there because Packer did not know the way. So back to Chief O'Ray. Yeah, he gave them food. I think they probably did a little more trading than they actually gave, but nonetheless, he provided supplies to them. And the best thing he gave them was advice. And he told them to stay here and do not go into the San Juans until spring. And some took his advice, and one of those that took his advice was Preston Nutter. And that's why Alfred did not have Preston for dinner. And I actually invited Paul Anderson. I don't know if any of you know Paul Anderson. He runs KOAL over in Price. He's a direct grandson of Preston Nutter. I invited him over, but I think he was afraid I was going to put him on the spot. But nonetheless, Preston took the advice. Packer didn't. So him and 5 others, so we're now at 6. And the ages are from 19 to 60. Very few supplies. And they thought that they had enough to get to Los Pinos, where the Indian Agency was, and they could resupply there. So they traveled down Montrose to Gunnison, and on to Los Pinos was the agenda. And Packer estimated 6 days of walking. They were all on foot. And keep in mind, Packer had no idea where he's going. And this is an interesting thing I wanted to point up was the weapons. And for this group of 6 people venturing out into the wilderness, I find it quite shocking that they did not have a lot of weapons. They basically only had 3. So either Bell was a member of his group, or Packer. One of them had a rifle. No one really knows who the owner of the rifle was, but they had one gun. They had a knife that Humphreys, he was a butcher by trade, and then they had a hatchet. And Swan, he was the eldest guy in the group, and he had a hatchet. So between these 6 guys, they only had 3 weapons: a rifle, a knife, and a hatchet. And I find that kind of strange, but it will play a little bit into things here in just a minute. So, and the reality of it is they only had provisions for between 4 and 6 days. They tried to stick to the mountain ridges where the snow would have been blown off. And right from the start, with all the calories you're expending traveling through that much snow, the food was pretty much gone. They started to eat their leather from their moccasins, their shoes. And there was these mountain rose petals that were left behind that hadn't fallen off, and they were eating those. And it was apparent to everybody that Alfred was lost. So here's a map of where they were going. You can see up to the top there, Delta or Montrose area. That's where they started. And where Packard went wrong, you can see this red line. He took the canyon too soon. He should have followed the green line up along the Gunnison River and then come down into Los Pinos. But he turned too soon and headed south and ended up into Lake City. So that's kind of where he went wrong. He took a right way too soon. So at Los Pinos, so they started with Alfred and 5 others. 8 weeks later, so keep in mind this is 8 weeks of living in the San Juans. Finally, Alfred walks into the Los Pinos agency by himself. Alfred claimed that the reason why he's by himself is because his companions left him. He had fallen in the creek and was cold and his feet were froze, and so they left him. So what's interesting is Preston Nutter, they waited for the snow to thaw, And within hours of Alfred arriving at the agency, Preston Nutter arrives. And then when Preston Nutter arrives, I'm sure Packer started getting concerned because Preston starts asking, where's all the other guys that you started to travel with? And of course, this is when the lies start coming up with Packer. He really became concerned because there was so many questions of where these other guys were. Packer claimed he did not know what happened. And then back to the weapons here, Packer noticed, or Nutter noticed that Packer had the knife that the butcher had, and he quizzed him about that, and Alfred said that the butcher had put it in a tree, and he pulled it out of the tree and kept it. So right off the bat, Nutter, he becomes suspicious about what Packer's telling him. Also, what was interesting that everybody found out in the group is Packer had plenty of money. He was penniless, and he had plenty of money to shop around town. And as time would go on, the rest of these guys would all drift into there after Preston Nutter and his companion. So they all end up there, and they all begin to ask the same question: where's everybody at? So Packer would give several confessions, lots of them actually, but there was always three main ones that always kind of circle back and forth. But what is it? His confessions always included that he did not kill him. He was not afraid of admitting that he ate his companions. In fact, there's times he was claimed he did it in self-defense, but he did not murder him for the purpose of obtaining food. Preston didn't buy off on it. Preston was pretty adamant that Packer survived by killing his companions. And what was interesting is Alfred agreed to take Preston Nutter and others up to the campsite where he had stayed and where he had acted in self-defense, or however you want to, whatever narrative you want to believe, where he had stayed. And so they go up there, and Alfred gets up there and he acts confused and he can't find the place. And again, that further added suspicion to Preston Nutter's opinion that he killed him. Here's a great picture. Here's Alfred having his friends over for dinner. We'll talk more about that, but there he's got the butcher's knife. And you probably can't read it, but there's actual, it's hard to read, but they've actually know which members of the parties there was names by him, but it's just such a poor picture that it's hard to tell that. So we don't really know who discovered the bodies, but it was most likely a newspaper reporter, and he wasn't really up there to find the bodies. He was just up there in that area, and they were found about 3 or 4 months later in August. And at that time, you can imagine the bones were probably fairly well scattered. But it was obvious to everybody with the hatchet marks and different things that the bodies had been chopped up and ate. So when they discovered the bodies, they took them a short distance and they buried them in now what's known as Lake City, Colorado. There's an actual cemetery there for them. What they did know is what they could tell is that they were probably in blankets, this reporter did, and that they all had obvious wounds to their heads. And what they figured had happened is Packer most likely killed them while they were in bed. They were hungry, they were cold, they were trying to stay warm, they probably were not very alert, and so he kind of took advantage of that. So as the heat gets on, Packer decides to leave. What's interesting about it, and this is really fun, in 1883 in Fort Fetterman, Colorado, Gene Cabazon was there, and he was at a boarding house, and right adjacent to the boarding house, he heard this very high-pitched voice. And keep in mind, this is 9 years later, and this guy could tell that was Alfred Packer. And so he goes and confronts him, and this guy gives a different name, but he notices he's missing those fingers that Alfred lost in Colorado. So he goes and gets the sheriff, and he arrests Alfred, and now we go to court. So what's interesting is at this time, 9 years later, where he'd killed all these people, there's actually a city there called Lake City. So they actually held the trial just within a few miles of where he had actually killed his companions. They present all three of his confessions to show how dishonest he was. He was found guilty, and he was sentenced to death. And there was a problem with this, and Packer had a very good attorney, because this attorney said you cannot sentence a non-native person to death because it was on Indian land. So they had to go back and adjust the verdict to 40 years is what he ended up getting. So, that's what happens, I guess, when you get a gifted attorney. So the death penalty wouldn't apply, so he gets his 40 years. So in prison, he was a model inmate. He would make crafts. And he found friends with the Denver Post. They were kind of his advocate. There was a lady there that wrote for him, and she would go visit him, and she would advocate for a parole for him. And at this time, you can imagine all the hype, all the newspaper articles and different things. And I think it was more of a curiosity, not that it was a concern, but it was more of a curiosity. And he was finally granted parole in 1901. And when he paroled, he went to work for the Denver Post as a night watchman. I also read that he was known to give candy to kids on the street and stuff. And then he died in 1901. He's buried in a Union Civil War cemetery in Littleton, Colorado. So in 1989, there's this guy. I didn't record his name down, but I read part of his survey. He decides to go and dig up the grave site. People knew where it was at, and so he goes and digs it up. And he's a forensic expert. This is what he did for a living. And he was able to tell that there was blunt force trauma to the head, and that most likely one of them had been shot in the head. But what's interesting is he found that only one of them had defensive wounds. So that they were all pretty much killed while they were sleeping and were not able to defend themselves. Perhaps they were, tied up into their bedding and stuff to stay warm. But this guy noticed, and he was an expert on this stuff, that it was very similar to other cannibalistic sites that he had looked at. And he also noted that the butchering of the bones and stuff were away from the less desirable parts of the body, if you will, which is pretty consistent with cannibalism. And this guy actually took a picture of how we found the bodies in the grave. But I could not find it. I could only find it on a video, and I couldn't find it. This is the one I was telling you about. This is the artist rendition. There's Frank Miller. There's Swan, the old guy. There's Bell, who may have had the gun. Anyway, that's kind of an artist rendition of it. So, kind of in closing here, and I just want to pose a couple of questions. Is eating people wrong? Les, I'm going to call you on the spot. Is eating people wrong?
Depends on how hungry you are.
All right.
I can see if it was the last resort, maybe. Boy, it'd be tough.
But would you kill that person to eat them?
No.
There's the question.
Have to be an organ donor.
Yeah. So, it does pose a very interesting question about people. I just wanted to thank my wife here. She made everybody cookies, and I made hearts and bones. And I do have some beef jerky for flesh back there. So anyway, she spent 2 days making sugar cookies, so I'm just going to embarrass her a little bit and tell her thanks for doing that. I thought I was going to get red punch and put in there too, but my wife kind of thought it might have been going too far. So. Anyway, Oh, I got one more here for you. So this book right here, I've got a couple of books on Alfred. If you're interested in really a good book on him, this is probably the one to read. I watched a video by a professor. I think she was actually out of the University of Colorado. She referenced this book as being one of the better books. So if you really want to read a book, it really is a very, very good read. It's got some good research to it, and it falls under the $15 rule on Amazon. So anything under $15, I just buy. I don't worry about it. So it's very cheap. I seen it there for $14. So I would highly recommend it. There's other ones out there, but I would probably start with this book right here before I dove into other ones. I think it's the best. And the other thing I like about it, this one compared to other ones, is there's a lot of stuff in there by Preston Nutter. So that's kind of my favorite book there. So anyway, thank you, and enjoy your hearts, bones, and flesh.
Can we ask questions?
Yes, except for Josh.
Please,
I was
anyone
curious.
that have questions?
I was curious, the 1989 forensics guy,
Mm-hmm.
he went back to the site that much later?
Yes, everybody knew where the site was, because that reporter that found the bodies took them up a little ways from where they were killed, and he buried them there. And then, so everybody knew that the cemetery was there, and the cemetery is actually on private property. But from what I understand, I think you can go visit it because there's actually a fence around it. So he dug it up, and if you go online, you'll find pictures of that excavation. He dug it up scientifically. You can see all the bodies laid there in different parts, missing from the bodies. And then when he got done doing the examination of them, they actually covered it with concrete. So you won't be able to
Do that again?
No.
Next to Lake City.
Yeah. I think it'd be fun to do two things. Go to the Alfred Packer Grill and Restaurant, have lunch, and then go over to Lake City. Anyway.
Lake City.
Yes.
I noticed when you got toward the end there, he was paroled in 1901.
Mm-hmm.
Did he die in, I thought it said 1907 was when he died, but that one
Yeah.
said 1901.
1901 is when he paroled, and then he died 6 years later.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay?
So he had children?
No.
I
No.
thought you said somebody
The
was
kids-
a grandson.
No. Preston Nutter's grandson
Oh, okay,
still lives in Price.
okay.
Great grandson.
Great grandson. Now, was Preston's daughter Virginia?
Yes.
So,
All comes through Virginia.
so Preston had a daughter named Virginia, and Virginia's daughter was Paul's mom, right? What was her name?
Paul's mom was Gigi.
Gigi, and then Paul. So there's still a direct descendant of Preston Nutter living in Price. Oh, one more back here. Yes.
What was your favorite part learning about it?
Preston Nutter, I think. Look, because there's just, the thing about Preston Nutter is he's such an interesting guy, and there's virtually nothing written on him. If anybody wants to write a good book, write one on Preston Nutter. There's lots of people referencing back and forth in different books, but I have yet to find a single book that's dedicated to Preston Nutter. I think it would be a wonderful read. He would become one of the biggest cattle barons in this area. And some of his ranches are still being operated today by different families. So
How many different books are there about?
at least 5 or 6 that I've seen. I own 2, but there's at least 5 or 6. And there's some other thesis that's been written that you'll find online too.
Did the other fellows have families?
Yes, some of them did, because I read where some of the families was interested in the trial and different things. So there was families, but I don't know really the details on it. And then if you're interested, there's my podcast I just started if you're interested. I just done a podcast on Sheriff Burns and his murder at the Mickle Corral with Abner Colford, or Mullen Colford and James Mickle. I kicked it off with that one. There's families on both sides of this mountain that are tied into that, so if you're interested. Monday I'll be releasing another podcast on Sheriff Jesse Tyler, who shot and killed Flatnose George near Hill Creek on the Green River. That'll be 2 series on him. So, thank you. I'm going to eat and run. I got search and rescue training, so thanks.
Thank you very much, Wade. That was a very interesting presentation, and thank you for sharing it with us. And we look forward to the podcast.
And eat lots of cookies. There's plenty of cookies back there.